All right. Good evening and welcome, all of you. I'm Brian Campbell. I'm the Executive Director of Physicians for Social Responsibility. PSR mobilizes health professionals and concerned allies to confront the gravest threats to our health and our planet. And we especially confront the threats of nuclear weapons and climate change. PSR has tens of thousands of individual members and a network of state and local chapters across the country. And I'm thrilled to welcome you to this community of advocates and to this important conversation tonight. Throughout our 65-year history, PSR has sounded the alarm about the risks of radioactive pollution from nuclear weapons testing, development, and use, and the radiation risks related to nuclear energy. And we're proud to be founding members of a new collaboration, the Coalition to Stop Radioactive Pollution, which is a powerful group of allies that launched earlier this year in response to the sweeping changes being proposed at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. If you haven't seen it yet, we have an amazing new website and a campaign, protectbetter.org, that's really geared to helping the public, all of you and lots of others, to understand these proposed changes at the NRC and to help you make public comments about these proposed changes. So we've got a great group of presenters tonight, and we'll have an opportunity for lots of engagement. So a couple of quick logistics. Tonight's conversation is being recorded, and we will share a recording with everyone who registered, and we'll also make it available online. So encourage you to share that with others who might be interested in this topic. We've got a webinar format for tonight, so your camera and mic should already be muted. But if you'd like to give questions to our presenters, the Q&A feature is the best way to do that. So you can drop questions in there throughout the evening. We'll have 3 speakers and then a time for discussion and Q&A at the end. So as I said, the topic tonight is really critical, informing you about ways that you can get engaged with these proposed changes to radiation exposure standards. You're going to hear about some of the potential impacts this will have on public health and also some ways that you can take action. So at the end, we'll share some specifics about how you can make public comments between now and August 31st when the public comment window closes. We all know that democracy is under threat in lots of different ways right now, but public comment is one of the ways that that each of us can weigh in on these proposed changes to critical regulations. And so thank you for your interest in this, and thank you for participating. We'll share lots more resources in the next couple of weeks, including another follow-up webinar next week that we'll share more information about at the end of tonight's session. With that, I want to turn it over to our moderator for this evening. That is Molly Johnson with the San Luis Obispo Mothers for Peace. Thanks, Molly.
Good evening. Yes. My name is Molly Johnson. I live on the central coast of California, 20 miles from Diablo Nuclear Power Plant. I am really happy to be here, and I'm really happy that you are all here as well. As Brian said, the NRC is proposing significant changes to longstanding radiation protection standards. They may sound very technical. The implications are very real. How much are radiation workers and communities going to be exposed to? How are they going to be evaluated? So our experts tonight will help us understand what's being proposed, what the science tells us about the potential health consequences, the legal and regulatory implications, and what these changes could mean for communities and workers. Most importantly, we'll talk about what you can do. So remember, the public comment deadline is August 31st, so there is still time to make your voice heard. We have an outstanding panel tonight, and I'm grateful to each one of them for sharing their expertise. Haakon Williams is executive director of the Committee to Bridge the Gap, a nonprofit organization focused on nuclear safety, radioactive waste, and the protection of human health and the environment. Mary Olson is the founder of the Gender and Radiation Impact Project. which focuses on the disproportionate health impacts of ionizing radiation on women, girls, and children. She is a longtime advocate for stronger radiation protections and greater recognition of gender differences in radiation risk. Dr. Brita Lundberg is a physician and member of the board of Greater Boston Physicians for Social Responsibility. She is a longtime advocate for public health and environmental protection, with particular expertise in the health impacts of nuclear power and radiation. Haakon, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Molly. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. So my name is Haakon Williams. As Molly said, I'm the Executive Director of Committee to Bridge the Gap. We are an organization that's been around since 1970, working to clean up and prevent the messes caused by the nuclear industry. You can imagine that proposed deregulation of radiation would be of profound concern to us. Responsible regulation of radioactivity cuts to the core of so many industrial systems that are related to nuclear fission technologies. So just to give a little bit of a basic framework, some of which you've already heard, but we're here tonight because in May of last year, President Trump issued a sweeping series of executive orders broadly aimed at boosting the US nuclear energy industry. And one of them in particular directed the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the country's main regulator of nuclear safety, to reconsider its radiation protection standards. This is the first time that the NRC has opened up its radiation regulations in a major way since 1991. So it's a big deal. And I think one of the fundamental messages I want to get across here is that this proposed weakening of radiation standards, which the NRC is now proposing, is coming at a time of the greatest interest in nuclear activities our society has had in decades. Many of you have probably noticed the uptick in interest in nuclear power plants. President Trump has directed that the US production of energy from nuclear fission should quadruple, going from 100 gigawatts at present to 400 gigawatts. Then there's nuclear weapons, which our country's in the midst of revamping our arsenal of at a cost approaching $2 trillion. And then you've got, of course, the long-lived waste produced from all these activities, some isotopes of which will remain deadly for hundreds of thousands of years. The Trump administration is proposing a new approach to this, the so-called life cycle innovation campuses, nuclear fuel life cycle innovation campuses, all of which collectively is a, again, very largely expanded degree of nuclear industrial activities, and particularly at such time, effective protective regulation of radiation is essential. So just to back up slightly, how did we get to where we are today? The NRC's standards for protection from radioactivity were already non-protective, and many of us involved in this coalition have long been critical of the NRC's radiation limits. The standard for workers at nuclear facilities in the United States are allowed to be exposed to 5 rem radiation, which is 2.5 times higher than what is allowed internationally, where the standard is 2 rem. That's a degree of radiation per the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, which produces the studies on which NRC fundamentally bases its limits. The National Academies indicate that receiving 5 rem dose every year, which is what's allowed by the current limits, would allow 1 in 5 people exposed at that level to get cancer who would not otherwise have gotten cancer. When NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, last examined and updated its radiation regulations in 1991, already at that time, the national academies had indicated that based on the science that was current at that time, radiation was even more dangerous than had previously been thought. However, at that time, the NRC declined to tighten its standards. Here we are 35 years later, and the most recent high quality science has only further updated our understanding that even compared to 1991, radiation is now understood to be even riskier than was understood then. The other presenters here tonight are going to go a little bit more in depth on some of what is known about the health impacts from radiation and just how profoundly the NRC's standards don't account for these impacts and are not protective of our health. However, rather than tightening its radiation protection limits in step with the best available science, the NRC is now proposing to go the other way, to increase the amount of radiation that you, me, and everyone we know may be exposed to. Probably the biggest headlines have come from the proposed removal of ALARA, stands for as low as reasonably achievable, the governing principle and regulations, which really should be obvious, that exposure to radiation should be kept as low as is reasonably achievable. That is now proposed to be removed from NRC's radiation regulations. The NRC has claimed that it is retaining its public and worker doses, that it's not changing the limits for how much radiation is allowed to be, that the public and workers are allowed to be exposed to. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. Yes, the public limit under the NRC's proposal would remain the same at 100 millirem. However, the NRC also proposes to remove the upper limit on alternative public doses, which nuclear facility operators may apply to the NRC for an alternative public dose with theoretically unlimited magnitude, whatever the NRC approves. For workers, that worker limit I mentioned earlier, 5 rem, already 2.5 times higher than what's allowed globally, already known to be non-protective as of 1991, NRC now proposes to allow workers to receive twice that dose in a given year. And then for effluent from nuclear facilities, so this is radiation in water and air releases, the NRC proposes to allow such effluent to be 10 times more radioactive, 2.5 times more radioactive by default, and up to 10 times more radioactive if facility operators simply submit some perfunctory paperwork to the NRC. These changes would have profound impacts across so much of our society, particularly at a time when, as I don't need to tell you, there is a massive proposed build out of data centers. There's a lot of talk of powering these data centers, and I should mention billions of investment powering some of these data centers with nuclear reactors. I mentioned the new proposal for nuclear waste sites, the so-called life cycle innovation campuses, which 5 states have now raised their hand to say they're interested in. It is, of course, critical that siting and building and operating such facilities are conducted with proper radiation protections, but with, for instance, from nuclear facilities, 10 times higher effluent allowed and alternative public limits with theoretically unlimited magnitude that facility owners may apply for and NRC may approve at its discretion. This is really, it's hard to imagine a worse time for this proposal to come. So I think that just about finishes up my remarks here. But again, those of us who have been working on this week in, week out for, well, really since May of last year when Trump's executive orders came out, are so grateful for your time and attention tonight, because it's going to take all of us if we are to effectively push back on this Trump administration proposal, and indeed not only defend the existing radiation limits, but to strengthen them. Thank you.
Thank you, Haakon. Very well. Thank you. And if you have any questions, we have the Q&A button down below going. And now, Mary, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. My name is Mary Olson, and I am the founder and CEO of Generational Radiation Impact Project. And I too want to thank everyone who's online and just invite you to hear this as an introductory presentation from me tonight. We're so hoping that we're reaching beyond. We love our community. We love reaching our community. However, we also hope we're reaching beyond it. So join us in conveying to the entire federal government and anyone who might in the future look at the comment docket. And that would include members of Congress. It would include future lawyers who might want to litigate on this. It would include perhaps our grandchildren, we hope, looking back to see what we did, because there have been so many victories. President Nixon wanted 1,000 nuclear power plants by the year 2000. Only a little bit over 130 were built ever, and I am so completely proud to be part of the community that stopped so many, has succeeded in getting reactors offline and closed, and are feverishly working now to prevent those older reactors from being reopened, which we haven't mentioned yet as part of what's going on right now. But here's the point. Radiation disrupts life. On this planet, life began in the ocean because water is a pretty good radiation shield. Space is full of radiation. Our sun spits out radiation, and it comes to us as sunspots and other forms of exposure from space. And of course, we have in our rocks uranium and its decay chains. These are all part of the natural world that all life grew up in. And the traditional science of early peoples who came to understand uranium have a very simple message, and we have yet to heed it in our society. But the simple message is leave it. Leave it. Leave it. So what's going on? It was in the Second World War that human beings discovered how to make atoms split each other. And so tonight we're talking about radiation. We're not talking about cell phones or microwave ovens or that kind of thing. We're talking about ionizing radiation. And in 1942, a bunch of scientists in Chicago got together and figured out to put the conditions together to make one atom split another. And this is called fission. Fission is something that may have happened in trace quantities on Earth, but in industrial scale, it is a human invention. And the products that come out of it, when an atom is split, it doesn't disappear. It has little fragments that are left. And these fragments are all highly radioactive because they've just gone through the violence of a neutron ripping apart a uranium-235 atom. There are other atoms that can also be split, but in 42, it was U-235. And these smaller fragments are the fission products that we know the names of: cesium, strontium, iodine, xenon, krypton. There's about 200 elements that result either directly from the splitting of the uranium atom or in immediate decay. There's about 200 total. And there is no level of exposure of these newly formed atoms that is safe. Quite frankly, uranium also has no safe level. There is no safe level of any of the decay chains from the naturally occurring uranium. In other words, radiation is not safe. And the current regulation worldwide recognizes this because it gives licenses to industries in order to have the opportunity and privilege to expose the people around those facilities, including people far, far away when the emissions are to air and water, to this not only dangerous, but in some cases deadly material. So they license it. And I want you to start questioning whether that licensing is appropriate. Because in 1990, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission itself told us how dangerous they see it. I'm not saying this is a fact. I'm saying it's what Nuclear Regulatory Commission told us in a publication in 1990, that a lifetime exposure of 70 years would result in one fatal cancer for every 286 people who got the 100 millirem a year exposure limit that is still the public limit. So 1 in 286, golly gee, that's many, many times more than living next to Superfund, where EPA provides protection of 1 in 10,000 cancers, not even a fatal cancer, 1 in 10,000 cancer incidents, whereas NRC is saying 1 in 286 for a perfect performance inside the non-exempted levels of radiation exposure. So I just want to make a couple of more quick points about radiation. It can make our eyes cross, I know. But back in 1942 in Chicago, they were preparing for weaponizing fission. The very first thing they did was to ship it all off to the Manhattan Project. And we know that the Manhattan Project's first real product was the Trinity test in New Mexico. And we're so pleased and proud that our allies who've been working on the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act have finally gotten what I consider to be really a pittance amount of money, but nonetheless recognition of harm and illnesses that have resulted from the exposure from that very first nuclear detonation. Fission, when it's weaponized, spreads those fission products all over, not just hundreds of square miles. Susan Alsner and Sebastian Philippe and others published in 2023 new maps showing that 43, or maybe it's 46 states got fallout from that very first detonation. It was not a local phenomenon. So we're all getting new exposures from these new facilities, ongoing exposures from the ongoing facilities, and historical exposures from things like not only Trinity, but 94 total atmospheric nuclear weapons tests detonated inside of the continental US, let alone all of the Pacific testing and all the rest of the testing from other nuclear nations. So it's pretty scary to me that they now say we get 600 millirems a year and act like, oh, just 100 more on top, so 700 millirems a year if you are only affected by one facility. But we now have new peer-reviewed research coming out of the Harvard Chan School of Public Health, the Harvard Chan School of Public Health, showing that a huge percentage of our population is actually impacted by more than one nuclear power reactor, let alone waste sites, let alone nuclear weapons production sites, let alone all the uranium processing sites. You know, we're all potentially impacted by multiple facilities. So that idea of 100 millirems a year falls apart pretty fast. When I first came into this work back in the early 90s, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission loved to say a millirem is a millirem is a millirem. It was my work 15 years ago based on the National Academy of Science report called The Biological Effects of Ionizing Radiation. It has a nickname because it's such an important publication. It's called Beer 7. And Beer 7 is what I went into to find the answer. Is radiation the same for female bodies and male bodies? And the answer is a resounding no. It's also a resounding no for children versus adults. A millirem is not a millirem is not a millirem. That number I gave you of 1 in 286 assumes that every single person in the 1,000 that they start with, a group of 1,000 is the number they start with, is a reference man. Reference man is a young adult male with a industrial urban lifestyle and all the things to go with it. Whereas frontline communities and children living in those frontline communities and women and pregnant women are a completely different situation than the reference man. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission is now giving options on how the licensee, the reactor owner or the nuclear laundry owner or the nuclear medical facility that's treating people with radioisotopes. They're all licensed by the NRC or their surrogate at the state level. And giving them choices on how to evaluate the exposures. But once they evaluate them, they're still going back in the federal agency to their guy, their special guy, their reference man. And we hope to cure that someday. At the moment, we don't have a good swap. We hope to get one. But the point here is that they have the statement, a millirem is a millirem is a millirem because they have reference man. But when you go out into the community that they're applying the standards to, you're going to find children. You're going to find infants. You're going to find pregnant women. And it's not only pregnant women, pregnant families. You're going to find people of all ages and various levels of previous exposure. Exposure is cumulative. It does add up in our bodies, and it can literally add up from radioactive pollution, radioactive air, food, and water, but it can also add up in terms of damage over time. And our next speaker is going to talk more about that, but I simply want to say that when it comes to understanding that has not yet been fully adopted, children do not have the same millirem as an adult. And females do not have the same millirem as a male. And worst of all, no one can confirm how many millirems they've had or how many millirems they're going to have under these new regulations. So I'm going to stop now with a final thought. I'd like each and every person on this call to really keep asking yourself, is it okay that we have a government that licenses these activities for, in many cases, for-profit entities that are making money off of using fission or using fission products that can make people sick at the rate of perfect performance on a reference man at 1 in 286 on top of all the other this is only talking about cancer. Again, it's what NRC itself says on top of everything else. We all know there's multiple causes for something like cancer. Why do they get to license activities that are on top of the background and on top of every other type of exposure we get at the doctor and the dentist? And yes, we choose those, but when we get it from these licensees, we usually don't even know we got it. And we certainly didn't have a choice except for this comment period now. So I'm going to give you my little funny phrase, but I use it all the time. Fission is a decision. It started in 1942, and we can change our minds. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mary, very much. And now Brita is going to expand upon that. Brita?
Thank you, Molly. I am, and I am going to share my slides. There. All So good to be with everyone tonight. I am so grateful to PSR for inviting me to discuss this very timely and important topic, and to all of you who are listening in the audience tonight. There we go. So the mantra of nuclear energy proponents is that nuclear power, nuclear energy is clean, reliable, affordable, and in our control. It's been a winning marketing strategy with a long history, going way back all the way to 1954, really. But that catechism of safety can't coexist with eliminating safety guardrails. This is an excellent article from NPR, which I highly recommend, which summarizes the current state of affairs, which is that the current administration is weakening and even eliminating many safety regulations, as Haakon mentioned, regarding radioactive exposures. In May of 2025, President Trump issued an executive order calling for weakening the radiation protection standard. In March of 2026, the Department of Energy acknowledged also having changed safety guidance that included deleting hundreds of pages of safety guidance that included former safety guidelines, weakening and eliminating rules regarding training guards, securing nuclear material, and protections against groundwater contamination. Another huge concern is that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, close to 20% of the staff, 500 out of 3,000 employees, have been fired. And as I mentioned at the top, the plan to weaken the radiation standard. A weakened safety standard and these amended rules potentially threaten the health, safety, and security and environmental protection of occupational workers, surrounding communities, of nuclear reactors, nuclear mining operations, and waste sites. Why? Because for over 50 years, the scientific community has recognized that all radioactive elements produced in nuclear development, including uranium mining, nuclear power plants, nuclear weapons development, can cause cancers in humans, including lung cancer, bone cancer, thyroid cancer, adult and childhood leukemia. And while high dose exposure to these materials are the most highly carcinogenic, we know that any exposure to radiation carries some risk of cancer. As Mary mentioned, fetuses in utero and young children are especially vulnerable to even very low doses of radiation. It's the scientific consensus that every additional exposure to radiation adds to the total risk for genetic damage and thus increases the risk for those cancers. According to the National Academy of Sciences and EPA, there is no safe level of radiation exposure. The likelihood of cancer is proportional to the radiation dose. It's a linear relationship, and that's why it's known as the linear no threshold, because there's no threshold below which there is no risk. And that's actually true for a number of environmental contaminants and toxicants: lead, benzene, air pollution, particulate matter 2.5. It's just that in radiation, we happen to call it the linear no threshold. I should also mention that there are non-cancer consequences of radiation exposure, including heart disease, immune dysfunction, reproductive harms, cataracts, premature aging. These hazards to health occur across the nuclear fuel cycle. Uranium mining is the first stage in that cycle, and uranium miners are exposed to radon. They experience increased mortality from lung cancer due to radon, and as well as traumatic injuries. Also, in the second stage, workers are exposed to known carcinogens: uranium hexafluoride, uranium oxides, and radon. Reactor operators and nearby communities are also exposed to radioisotopes that can contaminate both air, water, soil, and decommissioning and construction of nuclear power plants also result in significant radioisotope exposure, as does, of course, nuclear meltdown and catastrophe. Mary mentioned this clinical study, the Harvard School of Public Health study that recently found over 100,000 across the United States, over 100,000 cancer deaths since 2000 linked to residents near a nuclear plant. But we have known some of these results dating back to 1982. Here in Massachusetts, my state, they found a threefold rate of increased leukemia near the Pilgrim nuclear power plant. And interestingly, just released new Massachusetts DPH reports coincide exactly with what the Harvard School of Public Health found, with showing increased cancers around the Pilgrim nuclear plant. I'll just mention that I have been a part of a physician advocacy on this topic. Mass Medical Society in May passed policy. Given the current political environment, we felt it was important for our medical society to recognize that radioactive isotopes are proven causes of cancer, and that the linear no threshold model has been recognized for over 50 years. If any of you is interested, this recent article just came out in July, about 4 weeks ago, on the false promise of nuclear power, and goes into a bit more depth than what I'm able to do tonight. I also thought, in addition to what physicians are saying about nuclear power, and safety, I thought you also might be interested to hear what nuclear scientists are saying about the proposal to weaken nuclear safety standards, because you don't hear nuclear scientists quoted in the press very much. Thanks to Physicians for Social Responsibility, I was invited to attend this nuclear power conference at MIT last March. And one of the speakers, we were allowed to quote anything that was said in the conference, but no specific speakers. One of the speakers said, "How do we communicate that it is safe, that nuclear power is safe, if we are doing away with radiation protection standards?" And another speaker said that NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, independence is essential. It doesn't have appropriate staffing to move forward with new nuclear. And yet we are moving forward with new nuclear. I've given some thought tonight as to why we are weakening the standard now. And I wonder if it isn't because SMRs, these small modular reactors that have been proposed for development across the United States, actually produce more waste. They produce more waste per unit energy than larger reactors, between 2 and 30 times more waste per kilowatt hour of electricity, according to the nuclear physicists at that course, than conventional. And they produce more highly radioactive waste. In fact, those physicists noted that they found the cowboys culture at startups very worrisome. For many years now, it has been recognized among scientists and the National Academies of Science have called for strengthening the radiation standards. They have noted, as Haakon said, since 1991, that there are actually increased radiation risks per unit dose. And yet, despite that, the NRC since 1991 has not tightened permissible exposures. In fact, they are planning on weakening them. I would just note that climate change is actually increasing our exposure to radiation. This is a fire that broke out at Hunters Point in San Francisco the day before 30,000 people ran in the San Francisco Marathon. Hunters Point was where a lot of the legacy waste from our nuclear weapons has been deposited, and it is a Superfund site. And this was described as a small brush fire. It would be very interesting to know how much radioactive air pollution was generated because of that fire. They just noted that the smoke hung over all of San Francisco that day. And the other picture, that is a picture of Fort Calhoun nuclear power plant flooding in 2012. It closed shortly after that. But you can just imagine that with such flooding, since the ground, the soil all around that nuclear power plant is contaminated with radionuclides, that therefore that water became contaminated and likely led to surrounding water contamination. So in terms of weakening the nuclear standard, who wins and who loses? Who wins? The mining industry, the fossil fuel industry, the construction industry, and the banks and the other institutions who support them. Who loses? The communities across the country whose health will be damaged, whose lives will be shortened, and taxpayers who will cover the health costs that will result from those negative health impacts. And with that, I would be happy to take questions, and I will stop sharing and we can take questions in the panel.
Thank you. Very much. That was very informative. Actually, I took pictures, a couple of those slides. Definitely need to share those immediately. So we have 6 questions in the Q&A box. So I think I will just, I'm new at this. Brian, do I just go ahead and read them and then you will allow that person to answer?
Yeah, I would suggest you just read the questions and then the panelists can answer those. If other people want to add questions, go ahead and keep adding new questions to the chat as well. We'll get to as many as we can.
Okay, thank you. The first question is from Linda Williams. She says the rate at which these rules are coming out makes it impossible for the average citizen to participate and provide informed comments. Is the NRC in violation of the Administrative Procedures Act, which requires federal agencies to make the rule changes accessible to the public for participation? The NRC keeps denying extensions. How can we force them to slow down? We know that Executive Order 14300 has a November 26th deadline, but it doesn't specify how many and at what rate the rule changes should be released. Who would like to tackle that? Mary.
I agree entirely with the question, and I ask everybody on this program, this webinar, to consider if you are part of an organization that can do Administrative Procedure Act challenges and make that happen. I think capacity is a huge issue right now, and I want to say something that's going to feel a little bit weird, so please hear me gently and carefully say that in the last 10 years for sure, maybe a little bit longer, there's been a defunding of any part of any organization and any of the smaller organizations that work on nuclear things. And this has been a complex factor. I'm not attributing it solely to the priority structure of the funders, but certainly that's part of it. And therefore, I need people to hear that those of us who are on this panel, I believe, are working at capacity. And so we need to be reaching out to some other players who can just take a look at the ridiculous fact that they issued 23 different rulemakings under a single executive order. And all of those rulemakings have been coming out helter-skelter with different comment periods and different supporting documents. And it's just total chaos. And meanwhile, we hear that NRC staff has been cut. So they have a capacity issue as well. But I think we shouldn't just let this slide by and say, oh, well, it's what's happening. No, we need to do what Linda's suggesting and go after it. And all I can say is that I believe the whole thing altogether is a tactic, much like a magician uses a bunch of flowers and scarves and a bunny and a hat and things appear and disappear. I believe all of this activity is a great weapon of mass distraction, and I resent it, but it doesn't mean we should dismiss it.
And I can add to that in that we have been encouraging people to not only make the essential comments regarding the rule, but right now to be making comments asking or demanding, however you want to put it, for an extension to the comment period. And okay, so the next question, Tony Webb, and this has got
And
some parts in it. Oh,
Molly,
yes.
I wonder, it looks like Tony's raised his hand. I wonder if I'm going to see if we can unmute him and let him read his question out loud. What do you think?
I think that would be a great idea.
If you're able, Tony, go ahead. You'll just need to unmute.
Unmute.
Got it. We can hear you.
Good. Look, I think Haakon actually addressed the first points of my question in his presentation, but the one that hasn't been addressed is the issue of the replacement of the OLARA principle by a set of these operating procedures. The vast majority of workers, not only in the nuclear industry but everywhere else, are getting their doses in the range of 100 to 500 milligram. The regulations now propose that below 100 milligram, in words, if your anticipated dose is below that, you will not get radiation safety training as a worker. And below 500 milligram, they're proposing that you don't even need to be monitored. The effect of this is going to mean that workers' exposures are going to be defined in advance by the employer, and there's no way of checking whether they've got it right or wrong. There's no way for workers who get a cumulative exposure over their lifetime to then show that they've got a radiation exposure that has caused the cancer or the other health effects. And probably the most significant factor of all is that it takes out the bulk of worker exposures from the future studies that would enable us to show that we've got the risk wrong in the long term. If this goes through, it means that effectively we are deregulating almost all aspects of worker exposures for the vast majority of workers whose exposures fall in that low dose range.
I'm just sitting here going, wow. Does anyone have a response or to that? Or thank you.
Yeah, I think points well taken, Tony, and good to see you here. I'm sorry if I missed it, but is it just asking for our response to those, or is there a particular question that you might pose out of that?
I think he's just asking for a response.
I think he's absolutely spot on. It's
Yeah.
and it's going to completely render impossible the opportunity to do any kind of clinical studies of occupational workers, right? Because a huge majority of them will not be actively monitored.
I'll just
thank
add
you.
there's a lot of proposed changes here that allow for at quote unquote low levels of exposure that industry will no longer have to report any of their data. So in theory, they should still be monitoring, but it's clear that we're moving in a direction where, as Tony was suggesting, what's being proposed is to treat below a certain threshold, like we no longer need to report it. Eventually, maybe we won't even need to monitor anymore. And so, again, I agree that is really dangerous. If it's so safe, then wouldn't we want to monitor that and be able to have evidence to be able to, to prove that safety? If it's not safe, we should continue to monitor and report that data.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I see we're piling up on questions. Charles Francis actually asked two, but they go together, so I'm going to read them both. What are the top cancers that are caused by ionized radiation? And would it be healthier to rely less on nuclear energy as possible? Brita, can you
Absolutely, yeah.
answer that?
I will take that. Yes, the leukemias, multiple myeloma, and then the solid cancers too. So it was interesting when I attended that course on nuclear power at MIT. They listed off, five of the five cancers, and someone in the audience said, "But those are the most talked about cancers in the country. Those are the most common cancers in the country," and so it is interesting that some of the most common cancers in the country are the ones that are caused by radiation.
Thank you.
I'd like to add just one quick thing. It's assumed that the general public and the rates of illness are the background for the study. But given atmospheric nuclear weapons testing, all of the medical exposures, all these things, I highly question that. 35 years ago, 100 millirems was presumed background. Now it's reported at 600. So we're heading the wrong direction with non-industry exposure or previous industry exposure, and we're affecting at some level the overall disease rates in our society. And then we're turning around and saying those are the control numbers for the exposures from these facilities. There's something profoundly wrong in a scientific method in that picture.
Thank you, Mary. Dr. Lundberg, can you talk about SMRs and their differences in terms of risk?
Absolutely. So there was actually PSR sponsored a symposium on this on June 1st, and I am happy to share the link to that in the chat that discussed SMRs in depth, their economics, their health risks, but the bottom line is that they produce radioactive waste. There is no repository for this radioactive waste. And the health effects from that radioactive waste is identical to that of traditional reactors. It was interesting to me that the MIT scientists were not at all proponents of SMRs. They said there are no economies of scale. You're going to build 1,000 SMRs instead of 2 to 3 large nuclear reactors. And it's inconceivable that they could be built in time either to address any of the ills of climate change, the MIT scientists said, or the needs of data centers, because none of them has been built to date in the United States ever. Where they have been built, it is to produce heat, not electricity. And they're an unproven technology. And the technologies that they rely on are neither, quote, advanced, which is a marketing term, or new. All of them date back to the 1950s, the MIT scientists said. And many of them were discarded because they are dangerous. They have excessive risk of explosion, or they tend to leak radionuclides at a high rate. So they are not the answer, according to the MIT scientists.
Thank you. Thank you.
I would just add quickly.
Oh, yes.
On SMRs in particular, research out of Stanford has shown that small modular reactors actually produce more long-lasting nuclear waste per unit of energy than a full-size nuclear reactor.
Oh, true. Yes.
So
Thank you.
in some sense, the waste problem is actually worse from SMRs.
And then Catherine says uranium mining is rearing its ugly head once again here in the southwestern U.S. Are changes proposed to radiation exposure standards for uranium mining and milling workers? Can anyone pick that one up?
Briefly, uranium mining of the traditional varieties is not licensed by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and we're talking about specifically NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission licensing. However, they do cover the leaching, where they pump the acid in, and I'm getting the wrong name in my mind, so I'm not saying what you call that, but it's a specific type of almost fracking the uranium out. And then everything past the milling Once it's become yellow cake, all the steps of uranium processing are included. So conversion, enrichment, deconversion, fuel fabrication, all the supporting industries like laundries and repair sites, et cetera, for nuclear power, which can be specifically in the uranium end. But traditional uranium mining is not covered by NRC. It should be, or someone should be regulating it more than it is.
Thank you. And David says many of the nuclear facilities are being proposed for data centers as private non-utility owned facilities on tribal military superfund and now national security data centers, as the Trump administration dubbed Grok in Memphis. How does this affect oversight, monitoring, zoning, and regulation regarding worker and community exposure? Mary, are you?
I mean, let's put it this way. They're acting like it's loaves and fishes or something. It's not. This is the same radioactivity. This is the same exposures, types of exposures. When I call it radioactive pollution, it's specifically the type of emissions that go into the air and go into the water. That's one of the biggest changes in this proposed rule from NRC is 2.5 times more water emissions allowed. That's a huge jump. It should be going the other direction because radioactivity in water ends up in our drinking water, in our food, in our irrigation. It becomes radioactivity inside our bodies. And so all of these communities that are affected by a data center or small modular reactor or a reopened reactor to power a data center, whatever, it's the same story we already know. There's nothing new about it except for we have drivers of the car who don't care. They've never cared a lot, but these drivers don't seem to care at all. So that's where I'm saying, hey, the house is on fire. We've got to get going and show up and say the world is watching and hope that we get a new day in which I've seen Congress overturn NRC things. Back in 1991, we got rid of the below regulatory concern policy by organizing at the state level, got laws passed to prohibit the deregulation of radioactive waste and then recycle into consumer products. Same kind of deal as we're facing right now. And it got into Congress. And this Congress even passed the RECA, the Radiation Effects Compensation Act. So Congress is different than what we're dealing with on the executive side, even in one that we didn't think anyone cared. People cared. So, we got to go through all the steps. The step we're at now is commenting. The step that comes after that is appealing. The step that comes after that is hopefully getting into the appeals courts. The step that comes after that is raising hell at the state levels because these data centers are going to be at the state level. They're in communities. Those communities can't just sit by and see what the zoning board is going to do. You got to go to the meetings. You got to show up. You got to say hell no. Not just no, hell no. All right, I'll be quiet.
Thank you, Mary.
So unfortunately, we're at the top of the hour and we have lots more questions. Looks like 38 questions in the chat. I'm really thrilled that we have, over 100 people here. We had that many more who are registered who will get this recording. I encourage you to stay engaged. We will do our best to read through some of these questions. If there's ones that we can answer in follow-up email, we'll try to do that. But I also want to just encourage you to visit the website that we've got. So I'll just show you this amazing website that we have built together with the Coalition to Stop Radioactive Pollution. You can also click here at this toolbar at the very top of the page. This will take you to specific instructions on how you can submit public comments. You can also see here that we have a series of webinars. And so tonight's is just the first opportunity to ask questions and hear from experts. Next Wednesday, we have another one. This one will include some other great members of our coalition, as well as researchers from the Harvard study that you heard about tonight. And Tillman will be in touch about getting you engaged on a webinar the following week that will include some international perspectives, because part of what you've heard in tonight's concern is the ways that the NRC and the US, federal policy around radiation exposure is a really important but also is, in a global context where there's interest in nuclear energy in other countries. And so I know we had some questions in the chat about that, and we'll talk more about why this might be of concern in the US as well as globally. So stay tuned. All of this is available at the protectbetter.org website. Thanks again to our panelists, to all of you for being here, and for your interest in speaking up and raising our collective voices in response. There's lots to be outraged about right now in the world, and this is something we can do to speak up and take action. There was a meeting Monday of this week with staff from the NRC, and I think they welcome comments that are highly technical, as well as comments that are the kinds of questions that lots of people put in the chat, like, what about children's health? It doesn't have to, you don't have to be a technical expert or phrase the question perfectly to get it into the public comment and to force the NRC to provide answers when they put out the final rule later this year. So hopefully you learned enough tonight to give you confidence to do that. Thank you for being part of this movement, and look forward to seeing you next Wednesday evening for the next in this series. Thanks, everybody.